Section 10.1 is concerned with intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces are often abbreviated using the three letters IMF. So what are intermolecular forces? Intermolecular forces are forces other than covalent bonds. So what we're really talking about here are the forces that exist between molecules, and also the forces that exist between ions, and sometimes the forces that exist between individual atoms. But these forces are not covalent bonds. So, as you probably know, ionic compounds are always found in the solid state at room temperature, and they exist as what we call crystals, which are an approximately infinite repeating array of cations and anions. And the cations and anions are arranged in a manner so as to maximize attractions between the oppositely charged ions. So if we look at one of the repeating units of this sodium chloride crystal here, you can see that it's made up of squares where we have chloride ions on opposite corners and sodium ions also on the other opposite corners. And what this means is that the ions that have the same charge, have opposite charges, lie along the alternate corners of the cube. And so those guys attract one another, but the ones that repel each other, the ones with the same charge, they lie on the diagonals to each other. So what we're really saying is that the ions that attract are closer to one another than the ions that repel. Now, as a result, the whole crystal holds together because attractions are stronger than repulsions. Now, as you may have observed in the lab, ionic compounds have super high melting points, and that's a result of the strong attraction between the oppositely charged ions. So what this is telling us is that ion attractions are very strong. And it's important to recognize that ion-ion interactions are the strongest intermolecular force. Now, how strong is this attraction and how can we judge how strong it's going to be? Well, the energy of attraction between two ions is described by Coulomb's law, where Q1 and Q2 here represent the charges on the cation and the anion respectively, and the D represents the distance between the centers of the two ions, which is simply the sum of the ionic radii. So what we're really saying here is that highly charged ions form strong ionic bonds, and small ions form strong ionic bonds. Now, an ion can interact with the dipole of a polar molecule. And when it does this, what occurs is what's described as an ion-dipole interaction. So you probably recall that the oxygen end of a water molecule is a little bit negative compared to the hydrogen end. And so what this means is that the negative end of a water molecule can have an ion-dipole interaction with a cation. Similarly, the positive end of a water molecule can have an ion-dipole interaction with an anion. And it turns out that these types of interactions are quite strong, typically 40 to 600 kilojoules per mole, which is similar to the strength of a covalent bond. So ion-dipole interactions, again, are quite strong. So it's interesting to think about what happens when an ionic compound is put in water. When an ionic compound is put in water, we know that it separates out into cations and anions, and that those cations and anions stay separate because we observe that when we dissolve an ionic compound in water, we get what we call an electrolyte that can conduct electricity. So why does that happen? Well, what happens is that at the surface of the crystal, when it's placed in water, we get multiple ion-dipole interactions on our ions, and that pulls the ions into solution. So that kind of explains the process of dissolution. The dissolution happens as a result of the formation of multiple ion-dipole interactions that are able to overcome the ion-ion interactions that are holding the crystal together. So once the ions get into solution, why don't they start like pairing up? I mean, of course, the ions are oppositely charged. You would think that they would attract one another. Well, it's quite interesting what happens. So here's our cation, and you can see that it's surrounded by water molecules which all have their oxygen or negative end directed inwards, and they all have their positive end or hydrogen end directed outwards. So what's going to happen to all of that positive charge? Well, it's going to be attracted to the negative end of the water molecules that are adjacent to it. So what this means is we kind of end up with these alternating layers of positive, negative ions, or of charge around the ion. So the hydrated ion is surrounded by a whole bunch of water molecules that are attracting each other. So the hydrated ions are kind of stabilized in solution by these interactions, and that's what's really preventing them from recombining with each other and reforming the crystal. The same thing, of course, occurs for an anion, but the orientation of the water molecules would be reversed. So in the sort of outer layers, or what they call the outer hydration sphere of the ion, the type of interaction that is occurring between the water molecules is called a dipole-dipole interaction. So that is, it is the attraction between molecules that have a dipole, and that helps stabilize these ions. So dipole-dipole interactions can occur between polar molecules of either the same type, like the water molecules that we just saw, but they can also occur between different polar molecules, say, for example, the positive end of a water molecule and the negative end of a carbon monoxide molecule. Now, these typical dipole-dipole interactions, their bond energies are going to be significantly less than a covalent bond. They're going to be sort of a few kilojoules per mole to a few tens of kilojoules per mole. So if we're looking at the strength of these intermolecular forces that we've discussed so far, we have ion-ion in number 1. Then in number 2, we have ion dipole. And then weaker than ion dipole would be dipole-dipole. Now, what I'm about to show you is that there's a special case of dipole-dipole that's going to kind of like sit in between these two, and it has its own name because of the unique role that it plays in biochemistry. So dipole-dipole interactions are typically quite weak, as I mentioned, about 5 to 25 kilojoules per mole. But there is a particularly strong class of dipole-dipole interactions, which is called a hydrogen bond. And a hydrogen bond occurs when we have a hydrogen atom that is attached to a small atom with a large electronegativity, and in particular, when it is attached to a nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine atom, and then that hydrogen atom interacts with a lone pair that is also on a small electronegativity atom, e.g. nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. So that's what's happening in these water molecules when they attract one another. The positive end of the molecule is a hydrogen that's attached to oxygen, and the negative end of the water molecule is where the lone pair is on an oxygen atom. So it's the interaction between these two groups that gives rise to a hydrogen bond. So you want to be on the lookout for a hydrogen bond, and these are the two requirements. You need hydrogen on oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine, and you need a lone pair also on oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine. So hydrogen bonding in water molecules gives rise to an unusually high boiling point, and that's actually a general result. If you see hydrogen bonding is possible for a molecule, then you expect it to have quite a high boiling point. So hydrogen bonds can actually be almost as strong as covalent bonds and can have a bond energy of more than 100 kilojoules per mole. So why do we call them out specifically and give this particular class of dipole-dipole interactions its own name? And the main reason is because these interactions are really important in biochemistry. So when a molecule, or what we might call a ligand, binds to a receptor site in a protein, it almost always does that through hydrogen bonding. When proteins fold to form particular shapes, which we call the secondary and tertiary structures of proteins, they do so by forming hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonding is important in the pairing of DNA, so when we have those A to T and C to G interactions, and it's important in DNA coiling when we see things like the formation of like chromosomes. So all of these processes involve hydrogen bonding, and I'll give you a few examples now. So these are some common structures that we see in proteins. Now, in these cartoons, you have to realize that they've omitted lone pairs, and everywhere where you see an atom that doesn't have an octet, you should sort of mentally add lone pairs until it does. And so the first structure we can look at is what's called an alpha helix. This is a rod-like structure that protein chains might form. And you can see that the alpha helix is stabilized by hydrogen bonding between a hydrogen that's attached to nitrogen and a lone pair that is on oxygen. And for every twist, we get two of these interactions kind of stabilizing it. So that's how we get alpha helices in proteins. Another structure that's common in proteins is what's called a beta pleated sheet. And this is kind of how the protein chain manages to kind of make a U-turn, if you will, right? How it kind of folds around and makes a loop. And you can see that what holds this loop together is the same thing. It's held together by a series of hydrogen bonds between a lone pair that's on oxygen and a hydrogen atom that is attached to nitrogen. So we get a series of these hydrogen bonds holding together that beta pleated shape. So hydrogen bonding is not only important for how proteins fold, it's also important for how the bases in DNA interact with each other. And in particular, when an adenine base interacts with a thymine, which is how they always pair up, what we see is two hydrogen bonds holding that base pair together. Then when we have a guanine interacting with a cytosine, we actually see three hydrogen bonds in that case. So this is an interesting thing. The more guanine and cytosine that you have in your DNA, the higher temperature is required to separate the strands or denature that DNA. So the reason for that is because when we have a GC pair, we have three hydrogen bonds, but when we have an AT pair, we only have two. And that's actually an important characteristic that has to be considered when you are trying to sequence DNA. The more GC pairs you have, the harder it is to separate the chains. Now, we said that water has an unexpectedly high boiling point due to the presence of hydrogen bonding. So the question becomes, what was it that we were expecting? Well, one way of kind of guesstimating the boiling point of a substance is to look at the molecular weight. And for a series of molecules that contain similar atoms and similar types of bonds, what we see is a steady increase in boiling point with increasing molecular weight. And here's a series of what we call hydrocarbons. These are compounds that are composed only of carbon and hydrogen. They only contain carbon to hydrogen bonds and carbon to carbon bonds. And what we see here is as the molecular weight goes up, so does the boiling point. So that's a pretty typical result. And that kind of makes sense because in the liquid state, the molecules are close to one another and effectively touching, but for in a gas, gases are characterized by molecules being well separated from one another, and so it's going to take more energy to separate heavier molecules from each other and form a gas than it will light molecules. It just takes more energy to move them apart. So this is a pretty logical kind of observation. However, what we tend to see is if we have a series of molecules that have similar molar mass, so in this case they are 17 plus or minus 1, that the presence of hydrogen bonds radically increases the boiling point. So in the case of methane, this is a completely nonpolar molecule. There are no lone pairs, and there are no hydrogen atoms attached to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine, so there's no potential for hydrogen bonding, and as a result, we see that the boiling point is quite low, minus 164. Methane is a gas at room temperature. Now, if we look at water, it's quite polar, and it has 2 lone pairs on every molecule that can engage in hydrogen bonding. And as a result, out of this group of 3, it has the highest boiling point, even though they all have similar molecular weight. When we go to ammonia, we see that it does have a lone pair on nitrogen, and it also has a hydrogen on nitrogen, so it meets all of the requirements for hydrogen bonding. It's not quite as polar as water, so the partial charges on the hydrogen and nitrogen atom are not going to be quite as strong, so we would expect weaker hydrogen bonding. And also it only has 1 lone pair, so when 2 of these molecules collide, there's half the probability that a hydrogen atom will encounter a lone pair to form a hydrogen bond with. And taking all those factors into account, what we observe is that the boiling point of ammonia is intermediate between that of water and methane. Now, it is important to realize that hydrogen bonds will form a network throughout the whole sample of our matter. So if you think about any one ammonia molecule, it can actually form as many as 4 hydrogen bonds, one being formed by each of the hydrogen atoms and another being formed by the lone pair. So multiple of these guys are going to kind of like be formed by any one molecule. So we can look at some classes of molecules where it appears they're quite similar, but one molecule has the capacity to hydrogen bond and the other doesn't, and we can see a pretty dramatic effect on the boiling point. So here we have 2 molecules. One is called ethanol, that's this guy here, and that's the kind of alcohol that you can drink that kind of gets you tipsy, and the other is propane, which is the stuff that you use to fuel a barbecue. You can see that they have similar molecular weights, they're not identical. The propane molecule does not have any hydrogens attached to oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine, and it doesn't have any lone pairs. However, the ethanol molecule has all of the components needed to form hydrogen bonds. It has a hydrogen on oxygen, and then it has 2 lone pairs. So as a result, ethanol is a liquid at room temperature and boils at 78.37 degrees Celsius, so close to the boiling point of water, whereas propane is a gas at room temperature and boils at a little under minus 40 degrees Celsius. So you can see a pretty dramatic effect there with the introduction of hydrogen bonding capacity into the molecule. So to date, we've looked at the following series of intermolecular forces, and I'm listing these guys out in order of decreasing energy. We have ion-ion interactions, and that's going to require the presence of a cation and an anion. We have ion dipole interactions, and that's going to require the presence of an ion and a polar molecule. Then we have hydrogen bonding, and that's going to require the presence of polar molecules that meet a particular criteria. And then the final interaction with the lowest energy to date is dipole-dipole interaction, which requires the presence of polar molecules again. So energy is decreasing as we go down this list. However, it is observed that a polar molecule can induce or create a dipole in a neighboring nonpolar molecule. So a good example of a nonpolar molecule would be oxygen, O2, where we have two oxygen atoms connected via a double bond. Now, the two oxygen nuclei are going to be surrounded by a cloud of electrons. So if we think about what happens if a water molecule approaches an O2 molecule with its negative end facing the O2 molecule and its positive end facing away from the O2 molecule, well, negative charge repels electrons, doesn't it? So what's going to happen is electrons are going to get pushed this way. So what's going to happen is that electrons are going to accumulate at the end of the O2 molecule that is away from the water molecule. And so that's going to become negative at that far end. And then the other end of the O2 molecule is going to become positive. The water molecule still has its negative end at the oxygen end. So now we have a negative charge adjacent a positive charge, and these two things are going to attract. So what happened was that a molecule that was polar induced a dipole in a neighboring nonpolar molecule, and then that caused them to be attracted to one another. So this is called a dipole-induced dipole interaction. So this can exist between a polar molecule and a non-polar molecule. So it's not especially strong, but it is quite important. What we've discovered here is that oxygen will actually be attracted to water molecules. And the reason this is important is because fish need oxygen in order to breathe. And so if oxygen was not insoluble in water, then there would a large amount of aquatic life just wouldn't be possible. No kind of like, large animals would be able to live in aquatic environments. Now, this interaction is pretty weak, and if a sample of water gets a little bit warm, that bond gets broken because everything's kind of moving around quite quickly and there's enough energy to break it, and the oxygen will leave the water. And when that happens, typically everything that's in that sample of water will die. And you can see an image here of a large fish kill where that has happened. It's also why things like tide pools that are quite shallow, they warm up in the day quite quickly, and they often start to smell nasty as everything is dying off. Now, it gets even weirder. It turns out that nonpolar particles, things like diatomic molecules or perhaps atoms, can experience what's referred to as a temporary dipole. So what we're really talking about here is we have something that is kind of like nonpolar, and then temporarily all of the electrons move to sort of one side of the particle and induce or resulting in the particle having a dipole. And when that happens, what can happen is that we get quite strong interactions between nonpolar molecules or atoms. So I'll show you how this typically will form using the example of hydrogen molecules, which are nonpolar. So here we have two H2 molecules, and they're nonpolar, right? So they don't attract one another. And what happens is in one of our molecules, the electrons just kind of move a little to the left, just randomly. And so now we have a temporary situation, a temporary dipole, where one end of our molecule is a little bit positive and the other end of the molecule is a little bit negative. Now we need to think about how this interacts with a second molecule. So the positive end of this molecule is going to pull electrons towards it, and that's going to induce a dipole in our neighboring molecule. So now what we have are two adjacent hydrogen molecules that have their oppositely charged ends facing one another, and then as a result, these guys are going to attract. As they get closer, they push one another's electrons around more. The positive charge starts pushing more on the negative charge, and that interaction gets stronger. The electrons get pulled more strongly that way, which increases the charge there. And so now we have a positive charge, and if we have another hydrogen molecule out here, it's going to pull electrons in that one towards it, and the whole process repeats again and again and again and again, and it spreads throughout our whole sample. So this type of interaction where a temporary dipole induces a dipole in a neighboring molecule, resulting in an attraction, this is called a London force or a dispersion force. So even when we have completely nonpolar particles, there are still intermolecular forces. And so just reiterating, we have ion-ion forces between ions. We have ion dipole forces between an ion and a polar molecule. Between polar molecules, we can have hydrogen bonding or dipole-dipole interactions. And then now what we're saying is that we can have London forces or dispersion forces between any kind of particle, right? Whether it's polar or non-polar. So that's kind of interesting. And again, these guys are listed out in order of decreasing strength. So London forces exist between all particles, whether they are polar or non-polar. And it's kind of interesting. Often they are the majority of the forces between particles, or they are the dominant force between particles. So, for example, in a sample of water, about 75% of the attractive forces between water molecules are London forces, and hydrogen bonding just accounts for the extra 25% that makes water particularly special. Now, previously we had looked at N2, liquid nitrogen, when we were discussing magnetism. And so why would nitrogen molecules be attracted to one another and form a liquid? Well, the only possible explanation is that there are London forces between these non-polar molecules of N2. Now, how strong is the London forces between two particles? Well, it all depends on the ease with which the electron cloud of our particle is distorted. And that's called the polarizability. And the polarizability is basically how squishy the electron cloud is. And it's a pretty simple rule of thumb. Smaller particles where the electrons are close to the nucleus and held more strongly are less polarizable than larger particles or larger molecules or atoms where the electrons are held less tightly and are kind of more easily moved around. What we're really saying is London forces tend to increase with the molar mass of the interacting particles. So we'll look at this for a series of atoms and also for a series of molecules. So looking at a series of atoms, what we chose here are the noble gases. So this is going down group 8A. So obviously as we go down group 8A, we get larger and larger atoms, and we would expect these atoms to be more polarizable because we're getting more and more shells of electrons. They're getting bigger and bigger. And if they're becoming more polarizable, then we should see the boiling points going up, which we do. So this kind of makes complete sense. So basically, the boiling points go up as the molar masses go up because the London forces are increasing. Here we look at the same thing for a series of molecules. All of these molecules are homoatomic diatomic molecules, so they're completely nonpolar. We're looking at the group 7A diatomic elements. We don't have I2 here because it turns out that I2 doesn't actually boil, it sublimes, and we're looking at boiling points here. But here we are going down group 7A, so fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and obviously as we go down, the molar mass goes up. We're getting bigger and bigger particles. We would expect their electron clouds to be more polarizable. Stronger London forces, therefore higher boiling point. And certainly that's what we see. The boiling point goes up as these particles become heavier. Dispersion forces or London forces are also influenced by molecular shape. So in particular, the more surface area a molecule has, the more it can interact with neighboring molecules and the higher boiling point we would expect to see. So if we look at these series of molecules here, each of them has the same molecular weight and the same number of atoms. However, they have different degrees of branching, which reduces the surface area. So in this case, we have no branching of the chain, and it has relatively high surface area. In this case, we have one branch on the chain, and in this case, we've made the surface area as small as possible by maximizing the branching on the chain. And so what we see is that when we have large surface area, the boiling point is quite high, and when we have minimal surface area, the boiling point is quite low. So this is kind of long and flat, so it's kind of like if you were trying to glue together two flat things, that's going to work really well. The extreme example with the maximum branching is kind of like trying to glue together two spheres. They only touch at a point, so they have minimal interaction, so the dispersion forces are quite weak. In the intermediate case, you have something that's kind of got a bit of a curve to it, so you can kind of get a better interaction trying to hold these guys together, but it's not the same as when you've got two flat things. So basically, the more contact area between molecules, the greater the dispersion forces, and that tends to drive up the boiling point. So we also have to consider molecular shape when we talk about intermolecular forces. Okay, that concludes the section on intermolecular forces. I hope you found the video helpful.